Right on time. Hey, there we go. Okay, so while while Aya gets set up with audio and video, I wanted to start off with some like basic administrative things, right? Which is always the most fun part of any class, as we all know. So I set up the Zoom for basically the month of November, right? Just as a precaution and because I was setting it up anyway, so might as well. But Marcio and Alicia, you specifically mentioned that, no, Aya, you specifically mentioned that you hadn't quite figured out alternatives yet for getting to campus and getting around with the STM strike. Is this the kind of thing that you think you'll have resolved by next week? Or like how do you think you'll be able to work around this? Or is it something that for the entire month it's just a no-go no matter what we do?
Ladies first.
Sure, whoever can go first, honestly, it's just to plan better.
Well, if you we could have the lesson like this, I actually would like it very much because for me it's much easier.
Okay.
But if you actually say, well, we gotta be on campus, I can make it.
That's the thing. I don't know administratively what the rules are, right?
Okay.
Because I'll just give the example of the other place that I teach. I'm when I teach at Collège Montmorency, I'm actually technically not allowed to teach online, right? Like that is a rule that they've established. I did it for this week because I don't mind and I have very little oversight in the university itself. And I just wanted to make sure. And again, like I'll probably just ask around, see what works, what I'm allowed to do. But I was just trying as much as possible to find solutions to continue to do it in person. But if everyone continues to prefer online for the duration of the strike, so be it. Yeah. Um, Aya or Alicia, did you have any input on that, or
Yeah,
Honestly, same thing.
you would prefer online for the whole strike? Yeah.
Well, I'm still hoping the strike is gonna just go away.
Sure, sure.
You,
Like
you,
if it goes away, we'll just come back to class
you
and
have
that's it,
hopes,
right?
Alicia?
Yeah, exactly.
um, for me, I think after the REM opens up, I think it'll be a lot easier because it's supposedly opening on like the 13th or 17th or something. So I get still get to campus because there's a stop at Edouard Petit, and classes are a lot more productive when you go in person for sure. Um, Also to answer like your inquiry about the online meetings, we had a teacher ask the admin the first time because he was confused, and apparently like you only do it online when like the situation is it's like a crisis when there's only like two people in class. Like if it's you can still get like most people to come to class and you can keep it in person.
Okay. So in our case, it doesn't really matter because we're four max anyway, so we can do whatever the hell we
Yeah.
want. Okay, cool. That's awesome. Thank you for that. Yeah, I'll keep that in mind. Um, okay, so barring any changes then in strike action or M updates, as you were mentioning, Aya, um, until further notice, we will do it, I guess, online, right? And if Marcio and Alicia, you have any changes in your transportation, right? There's, I don't know, you suddenly have someone who is willing to lift you or anything like that, right? Whatever you decide, just let us know and we can always adapt accordingly.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Um, yeah. So um, next question. So Leonie's not here today. She had finished the novel last week. how far along did we get in the Tiger Flu since last week? Have we all managed to finish it? Are we most of the way through? Just to, again, give me a sense of what I reference or how I reference certain things in the book.
I gotta be sincere with you. I'm having a very hard time in order to understand this book there. And I didn't finish actually quite close to the end. It's
So
kind of,
close.
yeah, always close. And well, it's kind of blur for me, but I think I will manage to finish by the end of this week.
Okay, but that's good that you at least managed to finish most of it. Um, how
I can't
about
guarantee that I understood everything, but I did finish it. But the
okay?
ending was like, I got a word out of five. Like, I was very confused.
We talked about that a little bit last week of she just kind of launches you into the action and
Yeah.
expects you either to make up your own mind about certain things, um, or will refuse to explain it and it'll just make sense if it makes sense, which
Yeah. I went to
choice.
outside sources.
It's definitely a novel that makes more sense the more you read it, with the advantage of retrospection and hindsight. How about you, Alicia? I remember you had said that you'd gotten like 50 pages in the first time and then stopped. Did you manage to keep going a little bit?
I kept going, but I have a trouble with, I don't know, a lot of things in the book, so I did not entirely finish it. I will try my best.
Well, at this point, because it's we were only spending two classes on this, so this is our second class. Um, any book that you wanted to finish or any part that you wanted to finish would be if you wanted to, complete it for the sake of completedness, of course, or if you were planning on addressing it in some way, shape, or form in your essay. Both of which are totally fine. Sometimes it's fun to just finish books for the sake of reading books, but yeah, that'll be the reasons why you would finish it at this point. We'll talk about it at the end of today's class, but next week's text should be pretty fast as far as readings go. Mostly because comic books just take a little bit less time to read than bizarre postmodern novels like the Tiger Flu. So it should be at least a little bit more smooth going from there. And that part of that was intentional, right? I wanted to give you a little bit of levity, right, after the dense text that Tiger Flu is. And it was a very short text, but it's okay if no. Did anyone have a chance to take a look at the Donna Haraway chapter that I put on Studio? Yeah,
Yeah.
like 4 or 5 pages.
Patrick,
Yeah.
I gotta change places here. I'm at a core worker space here, at my apartment building here, and I'm gonna get back to my unit because there is so much noise here.
Okay. Yeah, no
Okay,
problem.
be right with you.
So
I just
while
remembered there was that Virginia Woolf essay. I forgot to read it.
I didn't put it up online, it was really something if you had the time to do it. That one was not super super important. It's first of all like an excellently written essay, and it does kind of inform a lot of the way that people think about illness studies today, right? Even if it is a text from 100 years ago, but it's less problematic if you haven't had a chance to read that one. We can go over it a little bit, just because it is a bit of a longer text, so it's not the end of the world. Yeah, and Alicia, did you get to the Haraway text at least?
I checked what it was, and I honestly just read the part that was really highlighted
Oh yeah, I
because I
gave you
was
the
like,
version that I highlighted, didn't I? Yeah.
yeah, I was like,
No,
oh, it
whoops.
must be the important part.
Sometimes I forget that I annotated some of these texts as well, but yeah. How about you, Aya?
I personally did not. I don't know how I did. I didn't even open Studium. I just read the novel like on a PDF. I just assumed that was the reading.
That's totally cool. Okay, so while Marcio sets up in his apartment, I'm just going to open up here um, the the chapter by Haraway, because there were a few things that I wanted to kick us off with. Um, can I share my screen while I'm recording? Yes, I can. I feel like I'm rediscovering Zoom and its pedagogical functions, even though I use it pretty regularly, but not as a teaching tool. Um, it's giving years ago flashbacks. Um, can everyone here still can see my screen?
It's dark.
For me, it's black.
Okay. Let's try that again. Okay. So I got a notification that said that Zoom quit unexpectedly, and I'm like, this is awesome.
Oh dear.
Okay, we'll try it a second time, and if it still doesn't work, then we will try something else. Can you see it now?
It's loading. Okay, no, it's black.
Damn it. Why is it doing that?
I think it is what you said about recording, screen recording, and videotape.
Okay, so take 3. I'm abandoning any attempt to share the screen since apparently it just makes my computer go haywire. Yeah, so I guess you can pull up Haraway's text if you have it in front of you. I just wanted to refer to a few passages here and there that I thought were helpful. Yeah, so part of them are the ones that I did highlight in the text, of course. But I do want to also point to the very first sentence, sorry, of the chapter. There is no question that anthropogenic processes have had planetary effects in intra-action with other processes and species, for as long as our species can be identified, a few tens of thousands of years, and agriculture has been huge, a few thousand years. Here's Marcio. So the key term here that I think is important to highlight is, of course, anthropogenic processes. Marcio, referring to the Haraway chapter, by the way, right now, is the very first line. Is the anthropogenic processes part, right? And I really like this use of the term processes. I think it says a lot about how Haraway thinks about various phases and, as my little notes in the margins indicate, various eras, right, that this planet has gone through, where even if we tend to think of these spaces and times as rather clear cut, right, especially in scientific discourse, where we tend to say, okay, well, such and such a species emerged at this time and then died, right, the dinosaurs, and even the dinosaurs are like subdivided into categories, whatever, and then the mammals came in, and then so on and so forth. The use of the term processes, and even, as we'll talk about in a minute, the idea of inter and intra action with other processes and species leaves a lot to the imagination and to the possibilities of planetary discourse, of seeing how all of these things are surprisingly overlapped and interconnected and layered onto each other. Right? And that's why I wanted to highlight that kind of first sentence. Haraway is someone who has written in theory for decades at this point. Her first major work was in the 80s, if I remember correctly. It would have come out. And she was already very much concerned with the possibilities of the body and human overlapping with other beings, right? She wouldn't put it in the terms that she does in this chapter here, but in her early work in the 80s, she was concerned with like what was very big at the time of technological integration with humans, right? And what would later come to be known as kind of like posthumanism and transhumanism, and all of these things. And so you already see in her work this thinking through of going beyond our assumed limitations as humans or as species, or of course, as this chapter indicates, the assumed connections between kin, right? Or what it means to be akin with someone else or something else. But yeah, I wanted to highlight that passage. I thought it was great. For those of you who read it or who looked through it at the very least, what jumped out at you from this chapter, if anything in particular? If the answer is nothing, it's totally fine also.
Honestly, I think it was all of the words she used, like plantatiousnocen. I'm not even trying to speak
Plantation scene.
correctly. Yeah, I was like, oh, okay, that's a word.
By the way,
It was
Marcio,
surprising.
sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, Alicia. I think you were trying to talk, Marcio, but you're muted.
Oh yeah.
Anyway, so I didn't want to interrupt you, Alicia. Go ahead, finish your point, and then
No,
Marcio.
no, it's okay. It was basically it.
Yeah, so she does kind of throw some words around, kind of like Lai does. Part of that is because this is chapter 4, right? And I wanted to give you a short chapter to read without having to overwhelm you. So some of the terms she does define a little bit earlier, but when she talks about plantationocene, it's a term that emerged and that would make sense for Alicia and Leonie for because we talked about it in week 1
Oh,
when we were talking about the Louisiana plantations.
right.
And the plantationocene is one of those terms that people use to describe the effects on both society, politics, and the planet of plantation style agriculture and politics, right? The association with slavery, how it was used to delimit and delineate certain portions of land and privatization and so on, right? And certain theorists choose this moment or this era, if you want to call it, as an important pivot point in the wide scale of human evolution, right? I think it's a little bit overstated personally, but she does at least mention it as part of like her wider project, right? So, but yeah, it is a bit of a complicated term, absolutely. Yeah, Marcia, did you have anything you wanted to add? You looked like you were saying something.
Actually, the last term we have there, quite close to the chapter title there, making kin. You have there Anthropocene, Capitalocene, plantation scene, and the last one. How do you say the last one here?
Cthulhu scene.
Wow, that what's exactly the meaning of that last one there?
Uh-huh. Aya, do you want to take that one? You would maybe remember that from our class last semester.
Oh, well, what is that one?
Yeah. I don't know if Aya, you remember when we talked about Lovecraft, what that has to do with it.
No, I
Sorry,
don't
what
remember.
term was it?
The Cthulhu scene. So
Cthulhu scene.
Cthulhu would maybe ring bells for you, Aya, who took our class last
C
semester.
Cthulhu scene?
Yeah, or Cthulhu specifically.
That very unfortunately does not ring a bell.
Okay. We talked
Can you
about
give
it
me a
very.
hint?
Yeah, it's fine. So it's related to Lovecraft, H.P. Lovecraft.
Oh,
Yeah.
I see it now.
Okay. So when she's talking about that, so if you're looking at the text, she brings it back up. So it's about halfway through the text on page 101, right, um, of the chapter. So at the very start, she references where she gets the idea of the Cthulhu scene. So Cthulhu was a creature that was created by H.P. Lovecraft, famous weird fiction, science fiction, horror fiction author of the early 20th century. And the reason why I pointed to Aya here is because we talked about him in the 20th and 21st century class last semester. And Cthulhu, you might have seen him in in images, right? If ever you've looked it up, he's like a weird squid tentacle monster, right? There's really no other way to describe it, and I see your confused look, and that's totally valid. It is meant to be bizarre and uncomfortable as a creature, and the whole point for Lovecraft was that Cthulhu was part of, I guess, his mythology, if you want to create it, if you want to call it that. This kind of interstory mythology that Lovecraft had created, where somewhere outside of our known reality, there are these gods, what he called these eldritch beings or elder beings. And these gods, like Cthulhu, are so beyond our comprehension that even looking on them and looking at them makes us go crazy, right? At least for Lovecraft. Now, where Haraway picks this up is not necessarily in the question of going crazy from looking at an extra dimensional being, right? She is taking it a little bit more seriously than Lovecraft might have, right? And Lovecraft was writing at a different time, of course. But as she says here, about a quarter of the way through, that page 101, I am calling all this the Cthulhu scene, past, present, and to come. Right? Note that she's not using future here. We can come back to that if we want. These real and possible time spaces are not named after H.P. Lovecraft's misogynist nightmare monster Cthulhu, but rather after the diverse earth-wide tentacular powers and forces and collected things with names like Naga, Gaia, Tangaroa, Terra, and so on. I think you could still make a connection with Lovecraft, even if she says that it's not named directly after him, insofar as the idea is to look beyond our mere expectations and our known realities, right? Which is 100% what Lovecraft was doing, even if Haraway is right to point out that he was also doing so with misogynist and racist rhetoric. So her point is basically to imagine the planet and our connections to various beings, whether it is the planet itself or, I don't know, the mouse that lives in your wall, right? As all elements and all potential kin, right, that we can associate with in order to create a variety of possible futures. Right? That would be the most simple way of putting it. Right? Does that make sense to people? Right? In some way?
Apparently.
Okay. Apparently.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it does.
Okay. So I had highlighted another passage a little bit further down that might illuminate this a little bit. One way to live and die well as mortal critters in the Cthulhu scene is to join forces to reconstitute refuges. There we go. To make possible partial and robust biological, cultural, political, technological, recuperation, and recomposition, which must include mourning irreversible losses. Right? So I think this is also an important passage to point to, because a lot of the how could I say, yeah, a lot of the literature that we've been talking about has admittedly been rather dour, right? The planet is dying and so on, right? And as you've probably noticed, what we've been kind of leaning towards more and more with people like Wong or Larissa Lai, or next week with Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, is that it's also just as productive to imagine death, whether it's the death of the planet or of individual beings, as not necessarily a purely negative thing, right? And that it is a part of a wider cycle. And what I think is so radical about Haraway's vision of this is that she sees these connections that we make with other beings, right? Or she calls it entities, right? Um, as a kin making process that's allowing us to live, yes, as humans, but also as kin, and therefore die as kin and continue to live on as kin, even after our physical bodies have perhaps died, right? Which gets into more of a wider concept of the planetary. Right? Anything that anyone wants to add before I start, like, again, going off on like tangents and rants that sometimes I don't know when to stop on? Right? Does anyone have any questions so far, or little
Just
additions?
about the term she used there,
Yeah.
instead of say creatures, she actually used another one, a very informal way, mortal creatures.
Do you have the page?
The very same passage there.
Oh, mortal critters. Yes.
Yeah, actually, she's using a very informal one to designate another one. She's actually writing an academic word there, and she's being a little informal to that. Is there any reason for that?
Yeah. I, th- to be honest, I don't remember if she mentions it anywhere in this chapter. Let me just. Uh, no, I don't think she mentions it anywhere. Hold on. She might. She might be looking at it also. I'm just looking through the text to see if she defines it at some point
Mhm.
more specifically, because I have my own interpretation, but I'm just wanting. I don't want to put words in her mouth either. Uh, yeah. She doesn't seem to. I think she just. Yeah, I think you're right. I think she just likes the term. Like, it could be something as simple as that. Um,
Creature.
yeah, so it sounds like creature, right? I think creature, one of the reasons why people avoid using it in contexts like this is because it has come, I think, right or wrong is up to you. It has come to have a bit too much of a negative connotation, right? For example, Frankenstein's creature, right? So we tend to associate it somewhat negatively um, with that. Or to take up Cthulhu, right, as an example, we would imagine that as a creature, right? Or the creature from the Black Lagoon or something like that.
Mhm.
Whereas critter, um, it almost, in my mind at least, diminishes or makes it almost sound a little bit cuter, right? Like you're saying, a bit more informal.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm wondering, because she never explains it as far as I remember, I'm wondering if that's part of her rhetorical practice here. She wants to make it seem more inviting to make kin with something like this, because a critter can encompass anything from a cute, fuzzy bunny rabbit, right, to a spider, which is not something you want to typically make kin with. At least speaking for myself, I hate spiders. So, um, right, right. So I think her way of using critter is to kind of alleviate that distance that we might feel with the wider non-human sphere that she's thinking of. She might explain it in another text, and she's just continuing from that. I actually don't know. I haven't read every single one of her work, but that's a good question, actually. Yeah, I genuinely don't have a better answer. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. Very good.
Um, Anything else that we wanted to add there? Okay, so part of the reason that I had you read this text to get us a little bit more um, into the discussion of the literature is, again, um, we've tended to talk about in this class of relations between humans, between societies, and typically between, if there is other creatures or are other creatures, um, it's usually like a regular quote unquote animal, right? Or maybe an agricultural plantation of some kind, right? I'm thinking of Rita Wong's text, which was all about um, refinding connections with things that have been severed and alienated from us in in the contemporary world that we live in. And what I think is so refreshing about Haraway's text in that lie keeps going in the tiger flu is expanding our horizons of what it is to make kin with all kinds of non-human things, right? And what the potential is um, to actually connect with on a deeper and more fundamental level with things that are completely different from us, right? And what that would actually entail. Um, and I think that's good of a connection as we're going to get with the tiger flu in this case. Um, there's all kinds of allusions, even if it's sometimes implicit in the text, to how non-human things of all kinds, whether they're critters, to pick up on the term that Marcio was asking about, or or even just objects, right? Everyday things, right? That reinforce and force a restructuring and rethinking of our everyday practices on a planetary scale. And that's kind of what I wanted to discuss in some way today, right? Um, Obviously, if you have any other questions about the text as we go along, we can absolutely go for it. But I wanted to kind of focus, broadly speaking, on that in today's class. Fantastic stuff. So last time we had mostly focused on part one, and we had talked a little bit about time, right? The time after oil, and that whole concept. And we had talked, of course, about illness, right? What is the tiger flu itself? And how do various people engage, right, with themselves in the face of the flu? And I guess to make a connection from last week to this week, it might be helpful to ask the question that is open to everyone in this case. Whoever wants to pick up on it, go for it. I'm not expecting a specific type of answer. Right? Um, in what way is the tiger flu, right, something that can be kin creating? I guess we can frame the question that way. Right? How does the flu and its illness allow us to make kin? If you don't have an answer for it right now, that is totally fine, right? but it is something that I think we can think about, if not right now, then throughout today's class. Right? Does that make sense as a question?
I believe so.
Yes. Ah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay,
Uh,
awesome.
Actually, I don't know if you can understand this as an answer, but I think the idea, the tiger flu there actually is supposed to be the key in order to get new kinds of kings there. Because because there, for example, the ladies there, the people there, they have to try to readapt themselves in order to continue surviving there. Actually, different people from different origins, just like Kara and Kirilo, they had to actually ally forces in order to battle the terrible situation they were living there. And this is what you mentioned in text there, Virginia Woolf's on being ill. And I just tried to read something there. And she was saying that when you are sick, you are actually disconnected from reality. You are living in another completely different dimension,
Yeah,
and you are disconnected from the society, or people from society see you in a different way.
right.
Uh, and this is the what happens in the book from Larissa Lai there. And they are feeling just like Cora. She is actually devastated by her losses there, and she is trying to reinvent herself in order to survive the bad things for the future there.
Yeah, I love all those connections that you made. I'm just writing them down. Sorry, Cora reinventing herself is excellent. Which, on one level, of course, makes sense because she's, if not the main character, then one of the main characters. So you would expect some kind of like reinvention to happen, or at least you would hope,
Yeah.
as a character in a novel, um, to have her change in some way because that's what we like to read in fiction. Um, but that's an excellent connection to Wolf. I wasn't sure if I was going to bring her up because Aya mentioned that she hadn't read her, and I wasn't sure if like it was going to make a smooth transition. But this idea of being disconnected from the world when you're sick in some way, right? Both socially, in terms of time. Again, to bring it back to last week, it's less explicitly mentioned in Wolf, but when you think of when you're sick and time just drags on and on and on, right? At times, even though it's the same moment, right? The second still ticks on the clock as it normally would, but it feels like 10, right? And so your entire world is disconnected from itself, right? Your mind is kind of disconnected from its body in a way, but also your body is disconnected from other bodies. And I really like that way that you mentioned it, Marcio, of the tiger flu being a kind of key, despite its ostensibly bad implications, right? As a flu that obviously kills a lot of people, it is also a Kickstarter for new ways of being, right? And new connections and communities, right?
So
Yeah,
it would be correct to say that tiger flu is actually a key to establish new kins there.
I would say so. I don't know if Alicia or Aya, you had anything you wanted to add on that, but I think that's really good. I think that's like an essay worthy question right there.
No, yeah, it makes sense because, like you said, it creates new communities, so new kinds of kinship. Because what you used to see as kin, family or friendship, is not the same anymore. So it's just creating new ways of having those relationships, but in different circumstances. So I know it makes total sense to me.
Yeah. Is there a way? Actually, before I move on to that, actually, is there anything that Aya that you wanted to add about the tiger flu as a key to making kin? Because I wanted to like push that a little bit further, but before doing that, I wanted to make sure that everyone had said their piece about this point.
I would personally, I wouldn't really say that it creates, I'd say it enables it more than anything. Like it's like a
Okay.
repercussion or a consequence, but I wouldn't say that it's like the cause.
Interesting. Um, what I would then ask the question, what is the difference for you between enabling and the cause? I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm asking for clarification.
No, no. Um, enables the cause feels like it's a natural result, whereas enabling it feels like it feels more targeted, like more malicious.
Okay. Which I guess makes sense, right? In the context of the novel, right? And again, we can have like a whole squabble about what terms mean, right? Whether cause is more natural and enabling is more malicious. But I can see why you would create this distinction here, and it makes sense in the context of the novel. I don't know if you all got far enough for that, but you find out that the tiger flu was used to target specific people, right? So the whole reason why the Grist sisters and Grist village exists in the way that it does is because they were experimented on, right? And that was a whole issue in and of itself. And so there is a question of targeting and malicious intent that then allowed this new this new kinship, right, with the Grist sisters to emerge, right? So I think that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, I like that. I'm um, I'm a bit on the fence about who I find more convincing here between those 2 points of it being a key or an enabler. I'd have to think about that a little bit more. I have to admit. Um, the question that I wanted to extend from. So we were just talking about how the tiger flu allows, whether it's as an enabler or a key, new forms of kin to exist, which is great. Are there ways in the book, from what you've read, in which there are forms of kinship with the tiger flu, as far as you know? Or are there ways that we can imagine kinship with a disease, whether it's the tiger flu or more broadly? And that's part of the reason why I had us read Wolf as well, or mentioned Wolf, even if you haven't had a chance to read all of her. I think she gets at that, although even though she would not at all have used those terms, because that just wouldn't have been part of the thought process at the time. Are there ways in which we make kin with a disease? I Yeah, I can give you a few minutes to think about it, but we can also come back to it a little bit later if no one has anything that they can think of.
Well, I'm trying to think about how this would connect with the tiger flu because in a way, I mean, the disease in general, you kind of have a relationship with it because you pass so much time having it or being in connection with it and or other people you are close to have it. So in a way, you kind of feel its presence in some kind of way around you or in you, whatever. So I guess there's this kind of kinship created because it's around all the time. So it's difficult not to create some kind of relationship
Hmm.
according to it. So I guess that might be a way of seeing it, but especially to take care of the tiger flu, I'm just drawing a blank.
Yeah. Um, it is, I have to admit, it is a little bit more of a difficult question because then we're getting into more abstract territory, right?
Mhm.
And it is one of those things that might require a little bit of closer reading in the text itself. And I'm gonna try to find, maybe I should have asked this question after the break where I could have like pulled up a specific quote. Um, bu- 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 Nope. I'll look for a quote during the break just so you don't have to stare at me flipping through my book for the next 5 minutes. Um, but on a more abstract level, I think Alicia, you are correct in imagining diseases of all kinds, whether it's the tiger flu or say a regular flu that we've all had, I'm sure, at some point in our life, right? It's, it's something that offers the potential of kinship, right? Even if it's not something that in the moment we enjoy. And I think it is important to note here that whenever Haraway uses kin, she's not necessarily saying that it's always pleasant,
Mhm.
right? We tend to associate the term kin, right, with a more joyful thing, right? Like, oh, I'm, going out for a beer with my kin or whatever, right? I'm not saying that we're gonna go bar hopping with the flu. That's not what I'm implying here. The idea being that again, you create new forms of being, right? And that despite the hardship that can cause, it is something that can some kind of some, um, so where was I going with this? I'm just going to look at my notes to make sure. So that Wolf's disconnection she mentions, right, can also be read as a form of connection with something else entirely, right? That is the sick body. You are connected to yourself, or you find a new community of likely sick people, right? Or people who are ill in similar sick ways, right? And again, I'm thinking to the Grist sisters, but also any other type of community that might have formed that is left kind of unsaid, right, within the context of the novel. That's where my mind is going with this, but I don't know if that makes sense or I may be overreading this, but that's the connections that I was making as we were going along. Anything that anyone wants to add or question about that? Sometimes I feel like I rant. I'm sorry.
Uh, Patrick, you said there that the kin is not necessarily has to be a pleasant connection, right?
Mhm.
So this is where, if I'm making a comparison between, for example, this Harry's book text there and
Mhm.
the Weak Planet, for example,
Yes.
where we are expected.
Yeah, I'm listening. Sorry. I just happen to
Okay.
have it right here behind me. Sorry.
All right, nice. And this is where they diverge, I would say, because as long as I understood on the Wiki Planet there, the kind of kinship are supposed to be is supposed to be to bring some good to the people who are related with. So, and here we have a difference. Actually, not necessarily pleasant, and not necessarily a pleasant connection. Is that right?
So I guess I guess this is where we differ. So I see a difference between good and pleasant, right? Because in the sense that when you when you do something for the good of someone else, right? You can intuitively understand that it might be beneficial in the long run, right? The most common way that we express this is for the greater good, right? And that can go very wrong, of course, right? When we do something for the excuse of quote unquote the greater good, right? And I'm not saying that Dimmock or Haraway are wrong at all, right? but that sometimes making kin with something like a disease or like a spider or like a Cthulhu-like being, right, can be difficult, right? That's what I mean when I say unpleasant, right? It can be difficult to actually do that in the moment, but it can lead to something, as you alluded to when that Dimmock talks about in Weak Planet, right? It can lead to something overall good in the future, right? Or overall better, right? So I don't think it's necessarily a contradiction. There's maybe a difference in how we go about it or how we articulate this, but it's not necessarily contradictory, right? At least that's how I read it. You maybe completely disagree, right? But I don't see it as inherently opposite. Um, does that make sense? Yeah, awesome. Um, okay, anything else we wanted to add on this? Um, okay. Da-da-da-da-da. I wanted, yeah, I wanted to start with the illness part that we had discussed last week, mostly as a transition point, but also because for the rest of today, I wanted to talk about other forms of kinship that are not necessarily related explicitly to illness, right? And so I felt like it would be too much of a jarring break if we had just started with that first thing in today's class. That's not to say that the tiger flu doesn't loom in the background, of course, of these other various forms of kinship that might exist in the novel. But what I would like to do, it's already 9:30, so we'll probably take a break in a couple of minutes, but what I would like to do going forward is examine the different types of kinship and get us to think about some of the terms that Haraway brings up again, specifically the ones that she talks about starting from the middle of the chapter up until the end of posthumanism and transhumanism, right? That's kind of where we're going to end on. And the reason why I wanted to end there and kind of come back slowly but surely to Haraway is because I then think it's going to be an excellent segue into next week's class on Swamp Thing. Okay. These questions of what it means to be posthuman or transhuman, right? There's a difference between the terms, and we'll probably talk about it either next week or this week. But I think it's something that we have to like start keeping in the back of our mind as well. Okay. Part of also what I want to discuss going forward is more explicitly the idea of planetary kinship. Right? So yes, there are forms of kinship that we've already alluded to as far as communities go, but there's something that goes beyond just the individual community in this book that I wanted to hit upon. Okay. Um, does that work for everyone as a plan?
Yeah.
Awesome. So I'm gonna go fill up my water bottle and take like a 5 minute break or so, 5 or 10 minutes. And when we come back, I want us to think about it. Okay.
All right.
Awesome. And yeah, I'll see you in a few minutes. Are we ready to start back again, or I don't know who's there or not since they're
I'm here.
okay. Cool. A, are you there or okay? So, um, yeah. So just to quickly come back to what to something that we briefly mentioned about Dimmock's text in relation to Haraway's text. There's a passage passage on page 3 of the introduction that I think connects well, where Dimmock herself alludes to Haraway and her tentacular thinking, and this is about halfway through the introduction, page 3. What opens up here is what Donna Haraway calls a quote-unquote tentacular bond, linking different life forms across the planet, allowing us to make kin among ecological devastations and to quote-unquote stay with the trouble we have collectively brought on ourselves. Right? And the only reason I brought it up is for the use of the term staying with the trouble we've brought on ourselves. Right? And to clarify what I was talking about, Marcio, earlier, about the idea of it's not always a positive thing, right? But it can be for the good of repairing in the wider sense. Right? And I think that key term of staying with the trouble can be helpful for thinking through that. In case you were looking for further ways of imagining this perhaps duality that's happening between Haraway and Dimmock. Okay. So we've talked about the Grist sisters, or the Grist village. We've talked about illness. I would say there is more kinship in the tiger flu than that. Does anyone have any suggestions as to where else that might be had? I would say there's at least 2 others, if not perhaps more. It depends also how far along you got, but if you got through most of the book, then you should be able to answer this question in some form. Really push the idea of like outside of the human, right? Or it's not just human centered.
The clonal lineage?
Yeah, the basic idea of the clones, right? Absolutely, right? That relates to the Grist sisters, absolutely. So that can definitely be.
It's the same. It's the same.
Yeah, the clones and the Grists are the same. Yep. Anything else? I'm looking at you, Marcio. I don't know if you can tell because like Aya and Alicia have their cameras off, but you know, obviously, that's anyone can answer this. Think of what this world is like. I think that can maybe help us answer the question. So what are the core components of this world? So we talked last week about what are they called? The rings, the quarantine rings. So that's a component of this world. There are different communities within each ring. That's a component. The tiger flu is a component. What else exists in this world? What do we know about this world that's out there?
The big companies, we talked about how they still do technology, I don't know, development and scientific research.
Yes.
And
yes, good. And part of that, part of those companies are the ones that produced the Grist sisters. Like we said, they were the ones that were experimented on and so forth. Okay, good. So again, there's kind of like a trouble being caused that we are staying with in order to create something new, right? So excellent. What else so stay with this. What else do the companies create in this world? Right? There's 2 very important components to this world that we see alluded to every once in a while and then suddenly become very important by the end. that the companies have created.
Error,
Oh,
disease.
oh, is it the separation of the body?
Okay, we're so close. This is fantastic. It goes to show just how much there is in this novel, even if we're not necessarily like appreciative of how it's approached. There's still a lot to unpack.
Hmm.
But yeah, terror and disease. What was the one you had said, Alicia?
Separation of the mind and the body.
Okay, say more.
Uh, and
How is the
didn't
body and
they?
mind separated?
I think they want to separate the mind from the body to like, I don't know, create a new entity. Like,
Uh-huh.
the idea of, I don't know, immortality, but that's usually what it goes with.
Okay, good. Where? What are they using to create
Oh,
to do this mind body separation that goes into like weird like cyberpunk shit?
oh my God, I know it. I like so close.
Think extraplanetary.
Yeah, isn't it like it's space?
Mm-hmm. What are Chang and Eng?
The satellites?
Good. Yeah, you didn't get to the end, Marcio, so maybe this is why there's confusion. So they are satellites. Um, they're more than satellites. They're data centers, right? We find that out towards the end of the novel, but it's alluded to here and there. But one of the things that Chang and Eng do are, first of all, they're owned by different companies, right? And they basically replace the sun and the moon in some ways. Um, and yeah, there are data centers where at the end, some people get uploaded to, right? Their mind is completely dissociated, and these people are sent into Chang or Eng, and they are made into extra human beings, so to speak, right? Or at least that's the idea, right? Um, there's a whole discussion to be had as to whether they are still human. Of course, if they're being uploaded to like some kind of satellite. Um, but yeah, so I wanted to, this was a really long way of getting to the point of let's talk about Chang and Eng, basically. um, so we can get to the uploading of consciousness in a second, but what else do we know about Chang and Eng? So they're satellites. They're owned by two multinational corporations. Um, what else can we say about them? Because I think this is a really interesting moment of trouble that can maybe be turned into kinship. Maybe. I think it's left deliberately unanswered in the book.
I'm really not sure about this, but don't they like upload consciousness or
Yeah.
something of the sort?
I don't know if you just came back. We just mentioned that. So yeah, they do
Oh,
upload the No, no, it's fine. So they do upload the consciousness of people, right,
mhm.
into Chang and Eng. So we'll absolutely touch upon that. What else? So uploaded consciousness, satellites, privately owned. We can elaborate
Like
on any one of these points, but yeah, go ahead.
they have like, don't they have like access to like information? Like they have like an information storage kind of thing where like they have like history and knowledge beyond like that's only like accessible to the elites.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. So if you want to like sum it up, it's kind of like Google and Apple each made a massive planet-sized satellite in space and kept it going, right? All of their servers and all of that is basically in space instead of in the Arctic, right? That's basically what we're dealing with. Okay. Um, but it kind of goes a little bit further in the novel, and that's why I find it a little bit interesting what she does with Chang and Eng, um, because their descriptions are surprisingly untechnological, right? If that makes sense. Like it took me a bit, I remember the first time that I read it, it took me a bit to actually figure out what exactly Chang and Eng were, right? I didn't get that they were satellites at first. And I think in part it's because of the way that they're described. Um, First of all, um, they're given names, right? They're given human names. Does anyone know what Chang and Eng reference, actually? It is a reference to a historical set of people.
Oh,
Yeah.
I just thought about Avatar: The Last Airbender. The only thing that came to mind.
I unfortunately don't, I have never seen the show, so I cannot comment on that one, but that's not what they're referencing. Oh,
Weren't they like attached twins or something? I'm
yeah.
really not sure.
Yeah, so we don't use that term anymore, but at the time, the term Siamese twins comes from Chang and Eng, right? They were the famous conjoined twins from
Mm.
Thailand, um, and they were paraded around like quote unquote circus freaks because everything that was not normal, quote unquote normal, was in the 19th century. Um, but yeah, that's who Chang and Eng are, right?
Mhm.
Um, are the original Siamese twins, right? Um, you can look up pictures on Google if you want. I'm not going to try sharing my screen again, but um, the so there is a bit of a implied personification that's happening, right, in this weird techno capitalist, hyper industrialized satellite set of satellites um, up in the sky, right? And I think that gives it a little bit of a closeness that we weren't expecting, right? Or at least that I wasn't expecting to have when reading the book. It's something that even if we don't like what is being done with Chang and Eng, as far as like data collection and consciousness uploading and all of that, does technically click something in our minds, right? That says, oh, I can associate with this on some level because it has a human name and presumably is talked about in human-like characteristics, right? Which again is something that we can keep in the back of our mind when we slowly get towards the idea of posthumanism versus transhumanism. Um, Anything else um, that we can say about Chang and Eng? Uh, they're even gendered, I think, at some point, if I remember correctly. I mean, they're gendered by the very fact of like the names being associated with two men. Um, so that adds to the human quality of them. Um, the only thing I had else on my notes about about this is that it's a really stellar, I guess is a good term, as good a term as any, because they're in the stars. It's a stellar example of how systems of power and I guess centers of power have been fully dissociated in this world from the nation state, right? And gone outside what we typically associate with earthly powers, right? Um, and this is where we can start to think about some of the more radical potential, right? Of what makes something liberatory and what makes something an engine for oppression. Right? because when it's wielded by Host and Lyft, right, the two multinational corporations, it's very hard to actually control Chang and Eng, right, and what they do with that information. Again, just use a modern example. Controlling whatever Google, Microsoft, or Facebook actually does with your information is nigh impossible, right? It's basically the equivalent, but 100 years later. And yet, there is a possibility, I think, in my mind, that these servers in the sky um, are indicated as having some kind of liberatory potential in the book. Um, where at first they didn't. And I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts on that, right? Where it starts off as a system for oppression because it's owned privately and we don't actually control what information they gather about humans or communities and what they do with that information and how they collect it or for what purposes. But then by the end, it kind of becomes emancipatory. And I'm curious how you think that's possible, right? How can something like this be used for new potentials? If that question makes sense.
Patrick, could you rephrase your question again, please?
Yes, that is my fault. I'm sorry. So Changaneng, yeah, all around not great at the start of and for most of the book, I would say. They collect data used for reasons that are beyond the character's controls, right? In many ways, for purposes that are undisclosed. So not necessarily a force for good, as we would typically understand it. But by the end, there seems to be a little bit of a reframing of Chang and Eng as, or Chang specifically, because Eng blows up. There seems to be a reframing of Chang as being some kind of force for emancipation or liberation in this world. And I'm curious how you think that's possible. How can something like this be used in an emancipatory fashion, right, or a liberatory fashion? It's not necessarily explicit in the book. I'm asking you to be a little bit abstract and conceptual here. But it is something that I think is implied and left open to interpretation enough that we can discuss it. Yeah, you might actually have a better way of because you finished it, but I don't know if. But obviously, anyone who's willing to can answer this because it is more conceptual. And I'm looking for a specific passage here while you think of it. I think if you're looking for answers, it would be in the last chapter. Chapter 43, The Starfish Tree.
I'm just rereading the part, by the way. I'm trying to fresh up my memory.
Yeah, that's fine. Sorry, I said Chang. I said Aang was destroyed. It's the opposite. Chang is destroyed and Aang lives. Point is that it doesn't matter actually, but whatever.
Um, I think I think that because Aang survives and it's in outer space, it does nourish a sense of hope to like towards that belief that there's a life out there. Like there's ways of living, like you can get out of that clustered circles or whatever they're put into. Like it just gives up it gives like a sense of like hope to know that there's something out there.
Right. Which, by the way, brings us back very briefly. I'm not going to go on another tangent, but by the way, brings us back to the whole idea of the Cthulhu scene, right? One of the no, but seriously, because one of the major ideas that Lovecraft was going with is that what we don't know out there is horrifying,
Yeah.
right? That was the focus of his horror. Whereas there's kind of a shift. I think you're absolutely correct here, Aya, that now that it's no longer by the end of the text a in the control of some faceless corporation that is doing it for profit, right? That is running this for profit necessarily. It becomes an engine for hope that hey, we can achieve something greater. And it is terrifying in some ways, right? Of having the satellite with all kinds of information and consciousnesses up there. But it's also in its own way, a new type of kin. Because the human species on Earth, right, hasn't necessarily stopped existing, right? It has just become something that has found new ways of looking beyond itself, right? Much like the kin that Haraway is talking about, right? Um, it is an expansion of literally the mind and the body in this case, and where a lot of the corporations rhetoric throughout the text, as Alicia rightfully pointed out, is all about the separation of mind and body. Right? That is the core of what they want to go for. There's a shift, right, with the change of control that happens on these satellites. There's a shift towards renewing the mind-body connection in a way that has kin making potential. Again, to echo Wolf, both with yourself and with possibly other planetary beings, right? As you brought up, that hope or that unknown is left uncertain, and that's kind of beautiful at the end. Um,
I
does
don't
that
understand
track?
how
Yeah.
it can be considered a kin within itself, though. They're just, they're essentially just data, no?
Well, see, that's the thing. They never kind of, but I think you're right insofar as like it's hopeful, right, at the end. But I think part of the hope is imagining what the possibilities of that data are, right? Because you're right, on a fundamental level, they are numbers on a screen, right? Or in a server, which is not fantastic, right? At its barest essential. Where the kin comes into play, right, is what you actually do with that data, right? Remember, for Haraway, the idea of kin is not necessarily with living beings alone, right? It can be with literally anything, right? It can be with a rock, technically speaking, right? And how we actually engage. No, but for real, you're laughing, Marcio, but yeah, like how we actually engage with a stone, right? Through whether it's through extractive purposes or just hiking up a mountain, right? Can be a way of renewing a sense of oneself, right? Or it has all kinds of impacts on the world around us. And I think this is especially true in relation to Haraway because, as I mentioned, she made her bones as someone who was thinking about what in the 80s she called technoscience in relation to things like the feminine body. And she was asking these questions. She used the term cyborg at the time, which has a new connotation now. We don't think of it in the same way, but she was wondering on a fundamental level, right? Now that in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, we are increasingly augmenting ourselves, right, with electronics and technologies. I'm looking around me, and just to speak to you, I have one, two, three, four technological pieces that allow me to communicate and exist as a human right here, right now, right, talking to you. At some point, it becomes a relational mode, right, of being. And I think what Lai is doing is asking you to push that to its utmost extent, right? Um, yes, on one level, it is the people in Eng are pure data sets. On another, they are data sets that used to be human that may have some kind of consciousness that they used to be human. It's kind of left uncertain, but that at the very least have engagements with human and other non-human things that make it that they can be kin of some kind. That was a long and roundabout way of saying that. I can simplify that if you really want me to. But does that answer your question in some way, Aya?
Yeah, it does actually.
Hey, I succeeded in some. It can be very daunting to get around. Like we're condensing Haraway's project, which is 45 years in the making in this point, into a single class. Like obviously this is something that we can talk about. I'm sure there are entire classes that are dedicated to this, right? Entire courses. So, we can definitely take some time with some of these concepts, or if you want to read more about it, I very much recommend that you do. Even though it was written in the 80s, her Cyborg Manifesto still rings true for a lot of contemporary situations, especially with the rise of things like artificial intelligence, right? So yeah, just wanted to finish on that. She's still very prescient in many ways. Good, 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 good. Anything else we wanted to add, or any questions that we had about anything that we just laid out as ideas, or any new directions that we wanted to go in vis-a-vis this?
About I had like about kins. I also just wanted to add that it also broadens the definition of a kin, whereas like me personally, like when I hear the word kin, I think of bloods, like blood
Yeah,
family. And here it's like, well, you have two different kinds of kins. You have your actual blood family, and then you have like whatever circle you're in.
yeah, absolutely. And it kind of broadens that in both directions, right? Like even your blood family, as you mentioned it, a lot of them are clones. So are you kin with just twins of yourself all the time? Right? That's a bit of a wild thing to no, but you're laughing and I'm like simplifying it, but it is a bit of a wild thing to imagine. So I think you're absolutely correct that
Mhm.
Lai is expanding on this. And it wouldn't be outside of the realm of possibilities, by the way, that she had read Haraway. Lai is an academic in her own right, and Haraway is a popular enough theoretician that she might have very well actually encountered her texts and thought about these concepts in explicit fashions. I don't know. In the interviews that I've listened of Larissa Lai, she never explicitly brings it up, but it wouldn't be totally outside of the realm of possibilities for me to imagine that. Yeah. But yeah, absolutely. An expansion of what it means to be kin beyond blood. Right. Good. I think Haraway would also like that, and she would say yes, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Marcio or Alicia, anything that you wanted to addend to that?
It's
Well,
not about kinship exactly. I was just asking myself, when I heard you say that, is there a reason why she mentions twins? I mean, it's not exactly twins, but like the satellites are named after the twins, and there is just the idea of clones, which is basically mirrors of yourselves, which
Yes.
a twin kind of is. So I was just asking, is there a reason for this
So
to be so part of the book?
yeah, okay, so great. Fundamental question, right? So of themes, and I guess it comes back to the to what Aya was talking about. Um, so the twins that are being referenced are Chang and Eng, the real Siamese twins. They were actually twins, right? I think
Mhm.
that's what they're talking about on a fundamental level. So the satellites, um, both in name and in, I guess, existence, right, mirror themselves. They both operate in the same way, they look the same, and they reflect historical characters that were actually twins, right? Um, to answer your other question, I think it is absolutely um, intended that the great technological beasts in the sky are referred to as twins in the same way as the clones are,
Okay.
right? And there could be multiple answers for this. This could be, again, subject to a greater analysis, right? Um, and before you think I'm saying this as as someone who's stretching the definitions of what can make good analyses, I've found entire dissertations that were written on the tiger flu. So there's a lot to unpack on
Mhm.
this. Um, but Lai is doing something interesting where asking she's creating a scenario where the basic principles of human and technology have been narrowed down to their core and base principles, and asking us a very common question in science fiction, but I think in a really interesting way, which is what makes us human,
Mm.
right? Um, because on the most fundamental level, all we are DNA that just decided to replicate itself, right? If you want to break it down to its core, right? The actual distinctions that we make between race, for example, or even from one man to another, or one woman to another, or even one woman to a man, anything, if at its microscopic level, we're kind of like data sets that reproduced itself. And everything is on its core level. That's what atoms are. And I'm being deliberately oversimplifying here, but that's the kind of move that I is also doing. Um, to come to the question of okay, so if we are just DNA strands that replicate and copy themselves over and over and over again across billions of people or hundreds of thousands of generations, what makes us different from a computer that is just copied over and over and over again and copying data sets over and over again? And you see this in the way that people talk about the human brain as a kind of supercomputer. You see a similar kind of questioning happening at the same time. Um, Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we are no different than a computer. That is not what I'm saying. I think humans are different in many ways, and animals are different in many ways than just a mere computer. Um, but it does beg the question of where is that shift over, right? At one point, do we go from being a self-replicating and highly advanced computer to human, right? And I think that's one of the questions that she's implicitly raising in referring to both human communities as twins, right? Like the Grist Village and the supercomputer. Um, yeah, I don't know. Does that make sense as an answer?
Yes. Yeah, no, it makes sense.
Awesome. Go ahead, Marcio. You look like you were going to add on something.
Yeah, you mentioned that we're nothing but DNA strands that are that tends to be copying like that. And on page 100 there, this text here you sent to us, you have on the second paragraph, at the end of the second paragraph, you have there, recursion can be a drag. And this is pretty much you are talking about. We tend to reproduce ourselves in this uh, idea of repeating, overlapping, and overlapping. That's the idea, right?
I would say so, right? And by the way, this is something that a lot of philosophers have brought up. I wasn't planning on talking about him, but that's the what I'm thinking of. Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence, for example, is what comes to my mind, right? Of history repeating itself in some fashion, right? So even on a action level, we tend to repeat ourselves, and on a thought process level, we tend to repeat ourselves. And I think you're absolutely correct. Where Haraway here is using recursion as a term, but um, she means it in a sense things do change, obviously, over time. We are not the same society as we were in 1702, right? But every once in a while, the term recursion kind of implies this. There are moments that pop up, right, that remind us of some kind of historical event, right? They reoccur. Right? The easy example, right, that people constantly make of like America being a kind of a quasi-fascist state, for example, right now, um, recurring what happened 75 years ago, right, in Germany. Um, and that would be, again, a bit of an overstretched but easy example to make. And it can be a drag, but I think what Haraway's point is making, and what I think Larissa Lai is making as a point, is that despite these recursions, there are still changes that occur both on a fundamental level in who we are, but because of those recursions, we also are people who can change, and kin who can change, and beings who can change. Right? So it can be a drag in the literal sense of like, oh, it can be a bit depressing to think that we repeat the same mistakes. But the radical potential of that is what we do with those mistakes that come back again and again. Do we learn from them? Do we create something new? And I think Larissa Lai and Haraway are both saying that, yeah, we tend to do new things more often than we think. Right? And that's kind of cool. Um, yeah, does that answer your question? Yeah, awesome. All
I
right.
wanted to mention too, I got curious and I did look it up, and she does actually mention like Larissa a lot. She does mention Haraway a lot, and she like based a lot of her things on her.
Oh, fantastic. Do you have the link to this article, or you just like looked it up randomly?
No, there's an interview and there's a blog. I can
Oh,
send them both in the group chat of the Zoom.
fantastic. That's awesome. I I'm glad that I wasn't just spitting complete yarns for the past 2.5 hours about these connections, that at least the author acknowledges them as well. Um, okay, cool. Um, ba, ba, ba. Yeah, so I mentioned that there were two other ways that there were two ways in which kin can be made outside of the ones that we had mentioned last week. So one of them were Chang and Eng, and that was a fantastic set of points. I would argue, and this is a much more depressing one, and we don't need to spend a lot of time on it, but it is one that's, I think, there in the text. there's something about food as well that might be considered a kind of kin, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Um, Rita Wong kind of talks about this, right, in Forage, where obviously um, she's creating new meanings and connections with the food that the narrator and speaker of the poems eat. But there's some really interesting food work in the tiger flu, and I'm wondering if you picked up on any of the things that Lai was doing with it throughout.
I don't know if it counts, but one kind of kinship that was transformed into food was Delphine.
Hmm.
Okay, so you are literally actually eating your kinship.
I wasn't actually thinking of Delphine, but that's a really good one. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. So,
And the way they actually have some plants there on the top of the building there, and they have some kind of kinship with that. Let's just call it ecological
sure.
way of surviving. There's another kind as well, as I see.
Absolutely. So the idea, I wasn't expecting Delphine to die when I first read the text. I was kind of sad. I liked Delphine as a character, the goat.
Yeah.
But yeah, you get one sense of kinship at the start, where Cora has this friend, right, on the most literal level with this goat, um, which is heartwarming. But it becomes another kind of kin by becoming food and sustenance in this apocalyptic world for the rest of the family. Okay? And again, coming back to the idea that we were talking about earlier, it's not necessarily always pleasant. Obviously, this is not a pleasant experience for Cora to have her friend turned into soup, right? Um, but it is um, a literalization um, of how these unpleasant experiences um, can be productive towards some kind of greater sense of purpose or greater sense of good for an imagined community. In this case, her family. Right? Um, there's a point in the novel that takes exactly what we're saying even further, and I'm wondering if anyone knows which part I'm talking about of food as kin. It's more towards the end of the novel. I highlighted that passage. Oh, I said, yeah, it is in the back half of the novel, that's for sure. Um, I'm thinking of, I'm looking at chapter 34 here, in case anyone's following along. Um, page 239 of the text. So they're talking about fish. What's so special about the fish they've been eating at that point in the novel?
It's somebody they knew, from what I'm
Mm-hmm.
guessing.
From what you're guessing, you're not even there. It is a good guess. Yeah. Um, have any of you ever seen it's a bit of an outdated classic at this point. It's a bit boring by modern standards, but it's a pretty good movie. Um, has anyone seen Soylent Green with Charlton Heston? It's like a movie from the late 60s or something like that. No?
No idea.
No.
Okay. Basically, the entire movie is centered around what takes like one page in the novel, where the main character of Charlton Heston, played by Charlton Heston, finds out that in this apocalyptic wasteland um, of LA, I think in like 1997 by the time the movie was made, so in our past, I guess. Um, yeah, the food distribution system uses old people. They turn old
Huh.
people into food, basically. Um, and I don't. Yeah, it was just a depressing movie. Um, and they tried to remake it, but it wasn't very good.
Excuse
Um,
me, Patrick. What's the movie's name again?
it's called Soylent Green. I'll write it in the chat. Uh, why is the chat not opening? There we go. Um,
Wow. So,
yeah, it's pretty good. But again, if you're expecting like a modern action sci-fi drama, it's not at all that. The budget of a 1960s sci-fi horror was not at all the same as what we have today. Um, but yeah, to come back to the tiger flu, on page 239, we find out that basically the fish is clones, right? Clones that they've been turning into quote unquote fish. In the same way that we kind of like have tofu burgers, right? That are, and I'm not slamming vegetarians in this case, I don't care, but like how we flavor tofu to be anything that we want to imagine it to be because people don't like the taste of tofu. They're kind of doing the same thing with this, where they're turning clone flesh into fish, right? So you were right, Alicia. Absolutely. So you do see a similar connection here between, or I guess echo from what was happening to Delphine into something completely different. But of course, the whole point of the novel is that it's taken further into a way that, I don't know, I felt more okay with. Maybe that's just me, but I felt less bad about the fact that the fish were clones than the death of Delphine. And maybe that's just me because I'm a horrible person. I have no idea. but, but
I agree. I was also very attached to the goats.
okay, so justice for Delphine is the catchphrase for today.
Make us t-shirts.
Sounds great.
Um, so, God damn it. So what was I gonna say? I guess it raises the question of why we feel bad about one being sacrificed for food and not others. And again, it might come down to the question that we were asking about Chang and Eng and the reproduction of the human species on its most base level of what makes us human or what makes something unique, right? Is it because Delphine was unique as a goat that we kind of feel for her a little bit more? Or is it, and because the fish is just clones that were endlessly reproduced, presumably, we don't feel as bad? They're so-called less human, right? I don't know. It's a difficult question to ask, and I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts on this. It's a question that I haven't like fully squared yet, in my mind, but I'm just curious if anyone had any thoughts on that. Like, why does it elicit less of a response in our mind? I'm asking that while I just look at my notes to see where I'm going next.
I think it's because during, like with the fish, it's more of like for survival. Not saying the goat was not for survival, but it's a different context where it like we had that goat as like the sole kin that brought sort of comfort to Cora. Like the other ones were all sick, so that was the only like kin that she had, I guess, that was like healthy. And then whereas like that's why we kind of feel more pity. Whereas like for the fish, I mean, like there's I don't know, they're not really, yes, they are for survival, but they don't have like as much of like a personal impact in the story.
Okay. So you don't actually, because you don't actually get any like background for the fish people thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't.
Like to me, yeah, to me, like the foundation of empathy is all based on context. Like the
Yeah.
more you know about someone, the more familiar you are with someone, like the more you're likely to feel any sort of compassionate feelings. We don't know anything about these fishes.
Right.
Well, like the people that were transformed.
Yeah. 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 The implication is that they were similar to the Grist village, right? Because the Grist village mentions at some point that they escaped from facilities like this, right? And they've kind of forgotten this after generations of cloning and perpetuation. But the whole point was that they had started off as these kinds of experiments or fodder, and some of them managed to escape and create their own community. So I think you're onto something, because if we find out that the characters of the Grist village were specifically the ones that were turned into fish, then it would impact us more, because we'd learned that they have a history of some kind, right?
Mhm.
Okay, good. So a kind of survival mechanism versus kind of history having. I like that. Um, I'm going to come back to this concept of history having beings. Um, Marcio or Alicia, anything you wanted to add on that?
I just would like to state that that's a very massive impact because
Hmm.
at the very beginning there, I saw Delphine as a pet.
Mm.
And now I imagine here if I come back home and my people actually ate my dog. And this is
Yeah.
not, I'm not gonna like it, of course not.
Good. Yes. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and well, actually, since it's a pet, it's seen as a pet, of course, there should be much more impact that you guys or everybody eating fish. And
Yeah.
I see this as a terrible thing. They were actually at their extreme because they were supposed to be eating a goat that was kind of beloved by the protagonist there. And well, that's a very bad thing to do, of course. But hunger speaks louder.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
And I remember that there is a movie called Life. The guys there on the about the airplane crash in the early 70s, and they
Oh
were
yeah.
eating.
What's the movie called?
I think it's Life, if I'm not
Okay.
mistaken. It's about handball,
Okay.
Uruguayan. I think it's from Uruguay. I'm
Okay.
not sure. And they were eating actually from the death. Of course, there's a large difference there, but you were eating from the human in order to survive and wait for the rescuers and extreme situation as well.
Yeah, 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 the one based on like the real event that happened in.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, okay, I know what you're talking about. Yeah. Hmm. Hmm. And it does say a lot about how different, not just how we feel about eating certain things, right? In the context that both of you are talking about. Also, how apocalyptic scenarios, like this clearly is, and are lived completely differently by different people. We kind of alluded to this last week, and this is something that is brought up every so often in conversations about climate change, for example, right? That these changes that are on a planetary scale don't actually affect individual people in the same way, right? Um, and you do get a really good example of this in the delphine versus fish people contrast, right? Cora and her family are more precarious, I guess you can put it that way, right? Versus the moment where the fish people are being eaten, they're in the if I remember correctly, they're in the dancing school at this point, or what we would call like a stable institution that still is around, right? Um, and their relation to food is much less precarious, and so they don't need to think about these things as much. Right? It's a sacrifice that they're willing to make in many ways, right? Um, because they can ignore where that comes from. Right? They don't have to think about it as much. It just appears, much like we do for a lot of things. I don't think about a lot of where my food comes from because if I did, I would never eat anything ever again because it would depress me.
Oh
Right?
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Alicia.
I was gonna say as a 100%, I don't think about where my food comes from either.
And like, I say that as a bit of a joke. I do try as much as possible, right? But it is very difficult sometimes to just completely completely dissociate from that, even if we're not in the apocalyptic scenario that the tiger flu is presenting with us. Yeah, anything else we wanted to say about this?
I think it's been said, but it's really just about how Mauricio said about how you wouldn't not want to eat your pet. It's just like
Mhm.
it's just the core thing when you think about something you really love, you don't want to hurt it. So like to think about having to eat it to survive is just like, oh my God, how would I do that ever?
Again, some wild stuff to.
Yeah.
Um, this is this is something I want to finish off and then take one last like water bottle filling break. Um, so this is something that we can think about a wider scale. So of course, we've constantly talked in this class about timescales, right? And about the history of the planet and what we sacrifice versus what we choose to preserve, right? And you can maybe jump onto this if this is something that you have. But one of the thoughts that I'm trying to connect between this book and planetary thought, right, as we're developing here, is what do we consider to be the history of the planet, right? And I'm thinking of this in the sense of how Aya was talking about earlier with, things that have a background you tend to feel more about. But how do you conceive of the history of the planet, right? As something that you should care for, right? I think we can all agree on this. Um, and it can be very daunting, and that's where questions of deep time that I've alluded to here and there in the class kind of come in, right? where where it's not enough to think of the history of the Earth on human terms, right? Because that is true, but it's also very limiting. We are a part of its history, but not the only part. Planet as an agent, as something that has agential qualities to it, is something that has a history and a background, and is still creating that history and its own background for both us and itself going forward, despite it being ill in many ways. I think to fully come back to Haraway again, this is one of the things that she's alluding to throughout her text is that the planet as a whole is something that you can make kin with, both as something that has a history in its own right, much like Delphine, um, but also making kin with the planet as a way of creating new histories for itself and us. Um, and I think that's that's kind of where my thought is leading me so far with this whole idea of engaging with what has history versus what doesn't, and what that actually implies for how we make kin. Um, yeah, I think we can kind of think on that for a sec. Like I said, I'm just going to go fill up my water bottle, and then we'll conclude with some final thoughts uh, on any of this. Okay. It doesn't have to be with like the kin making. We've talked about it quite a bit, but just any final thoughts that we have on tiger flu and everything else, and then we'll transition into Swamp Thing. Does that work for everyone?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So yeah, see you around 10:50 or so. Okay. Okay, so Marcio's here. Aya and Leisha, are you back?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So, um, yeah, I guess I'll launch it to you. I feel like I've been kind of um, asking you a bunch of questions about this text, and I'm just curious because you've all mostly finished it. Is there anything else, either something that we've haven't talked about or that is tangentially related to what we've talked about that you wanted to highlight in the text that you thought was worth sharing or that you thought was interesting to think through? I'm kind of leaving it open here on our last few minutes just to make sure that we've covered at least a satisfactory level of things from the tiger flu. I'm just curious.
Actually, there is something that I think
Mhm.
there should be something else about the dancing in school there.
Yes.
I know they were living in a very terrified world and all that stuff there. But even though there should be some time for some leisure, and I think there is some discrepancy there. I don't quite follow. There is some other meaning behind that school there, other than going there to have some relaxing moments, or
So is it really a dancing school?
yeah, that's the thing.
Yeah.
There should be something else.
Um, so they learn basically they're basically a school of thieves, right? It's kind of what it is. It's a survival school, right? And I think you ask a really good question, and I don't know if our other two participants have thought of this at all, but I think you ask a good question where it's called a dancing school. You don't really see much dancing going on, but it is a school for survival, which begs two questions. One, is it just a lie? Right? They're calling it a dancing school to make it sound better than it actually is, right? And less depressing. Right? Or is it more of an illusion? And I think this is the more interesting thing to think through. Is it more of an allusion to the fact that in order to survive in the apocalypse, you do need some kind of art and some kind of aesthetic pleasures to come back to what you were saying. I don't think this is something that's ever really satisfactorily answered in the novel. Right? Having read it a few times, I think this is one of those things that could have gone into a really interesting direction, and it never really does, at least in my reading of it. Um, but I do think you ask a good question. What role does art, like dancing or like literature, have in the apocalypse? I think it has a great deal to do with it, personally, right? For two reasons, and you can all pick up on any of this at any point, right? one, in the way that we've been talking about it in this class, it gives a way of talking about and actually understanding the changes that people go through, right? And I think that's always important, right? Um, that's the whole point of poetry, right? And painting is to actually express things that would take thousands of pages to actually express otherwise, right? Um, and so, in the face of planetary issues like we're facing and talking about in this class, novels like Larissa, like The Tiger Flew, or dancing, right, like is kind of alluded to in this book, become thoroughly important, right, as a vehicle to communicate and express thinking otherwise, right, or ways of thought otherwise. Um, on a more fundamental level, even if the planet does go through an apocalypse as is described in the text, I still think we'll make art, right? And that's a beautiful and I think hopeful aspect of this book that slightly ends on a similar note, um, where they mention by the end, it's not art specifically, but these aesthetic considerations, right, of gardens and setting out of creating new and beautiful things in the ruins of old things, right? What is that if not art? And so, even if we'd like to imagine that there is a thorough endpoint in these apocalypses, art will still go on, right, in kind of some way. And that's what I'm thinking of when I was thinking of that dancing school. That is the possibility that it offers, but again, I don't think the novel ever kind of delves into it as much as it maybe could or should. That can maybe be something that you can explore in a critical reading. Right? It's a little short, little burst of ideas in this case. Yeah. I don't know. Is that what you had in mind, Marcio, when you brought that up? Or maybe that's me being idealistic and schmaltzy.
Actually, it was going like incognito to me,
Oh,
and
cool. Much
yeah,
better.
but now you mentioned that it could mean hope and art, and where there is art, there is hope, I guess. And it makes much more sense than just a mere school of thieves, which it's more like when you see the girls there and they are bullies, a whole bunch of bullies, and
Yeah, they suck. Like they just are
indeed.
awful. But say more about the incognito thing. I'm not sure I follow.
I know because that's the thing that I didn't understand because okay, they are in a very bad situation there. They
Mhm.
don't have enough to eat, but there is room for some kind of art. There is some pleasure, and that's the thing. And I was kind of wondering, okay, that that dancing in school is not just that. There should be more.
Right. Okay.
That's the point. And
No, I like
now
that.
it's much more clear, I guess.
This is my interpreting. Like again,
Oh,
this is
okay.
like we are going into like super interpretative territory because it's not really addressed in the novel here. Um, so kind of take it into whatever direction you feel most comfortable with, and I purely mean this in the literal sense here.
And
Um,
that's what you like you mentioned at the very first class there.
mm,
That's what literature should be like,
yeah,
giving room to imagination, interpretation, and things like that.
yeah, yeah. Again, I know some people think that it's an impossibility in the modern world, right? But I think those people are should seek clinical help for depression because then what's the point of any of this? Um, Aya and Alicia, is there anything that you wanted to talk about in the text that we haven't discussed yet, just to give it its due diligence?
Um, I do think that there's also a lot of reliance on allegories and
Hmm.
symbolism. I
Good.
feel like every single element or person or structure or whatever is so loaded with like criticism of our modern world.
Yes. Yeah. I like that. Allegory. We don't have time to necessarily get into like the difference between allegory and metaphor here because that's not this type of class. But thinking through whether or not it is allegory or metaphor is perhaps a worthy thing to unpack again in a wider project. But even if we don't take it into a super deep analysis for today, I think you're 100% correct, and this is right down on the level of language. I'm going to reference the last chapter again, just because it's at hand and easy and beautiful. Um, let's see. Yeah, just as an example of what you're talking about, Aya, for me on page 327, towards the top, so slow to learn. The tree has no mouth, it vibrates language. In the old days, after lying with a man, a woman would grow, as you do, like a giant sister egg, for the same 40 terrible weeks that you will all one day endure. And all for what? Not a litter of daughter doubles, but only one. So you get this highly evocative language that, even though it makes it, again, very difficult for us to understand what is fundamentally happening on a plot level, right? I think is what makes this a novel that I encourage you to return to over and over again, because it wants you to constantly reinterpret what is actually being said, right? Which is, I think, the main point of metaphor and allegory. We like to think of them as very clear cut, right? As this means this, or this is a stand in for this, right? But even the most seemingly clear cut of allegories or metaphors are rife with reinterpretation, right? To come back to what we had said earlier, based on context, right? Our context changes them in new and completely radical ways, right? So that the first time that I read "The tree has no mouth, it vibrates language" and so on, I was just thinking, well, Cora, the Cora tree, as they call it, right, is just like a kind of AI kind of computer, right? Nothing much to it. It's just a weird thing that looks like a tree but is speaking in Cora's voice. But now when I read this passage, it says a lot more to me about the nature of how we change over time, right? And again, these ideas of kin that we've been discussing in this class today, right? Where Cora has fully turned into something new and yet is still identifiable as Cora. Yeah. I don't know. I think that's a very good point. Anything that you wanted to add to that, Aya? Or any examples that came to mind?
Like, but it's not necessarily positive, like what I
That's
said
fine.
about it being
No,
like
I'm
heavily loaded
I'm
with
saying
them.
it's positive, but you can
Oh,
absolutely take it into a negative creative way. Yeah.
I like I think it's just like overbearing, like
Oh, okay.
too way too many. Like on
Oh,
top
okay.
of all of the unfamiliar terms and unfamiliar structure,
Yeah.
on top of
Okay.
that, like everything has to have a double connotation. I don't know. I think it was not flawlessly executed, but that's just
Okay.
my humble opinion.
Okay. Um, that Yeah, it's very postmodern in that sense of the double
Yeah, it is.
connotations. Yeah, which I can see is, yeah, not for everyone. That totally fair. I like that. I really enjoy these novels. As you can see, I've just spouted on for like 10 minutes about something that you hated, but the
No,
but
it's good to get me out of my Russian bubble.
sure. No, I get what you mean, but it is by definition rather disconcerting, right, and discomforting. Good. Um, Alicia?
Yes.
No, I was just wondering if you had anything that you wanted to signal about the novel.
No, honestly, I think everything was pretty much brought up. That comes to mind anyway. Maybe it's just me, but I also found it very discomforting and
Yeah.
kind of gore at points,
Yeah.
so that makes me feel uncomfortable. So I had trouble reading it, but otherwise it was pretty entertaining.
Okay. Entertaining is a good word. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, because so much
uh,
happens and there's so much to focus on.
mhm.
I feel like I have to look at it more than once for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely got more out of it after I read it the first time. Yeah. Um, okay. So one of the last things I want to do here, there's a kind of um, chorus, I guess you can call it, throughout the book. If you noticed, great. If it went past you, that's also fine. So every once in a while, they have these little songs that they or these prayers. It's a bit unclear if they're both song or prayer that are mentioned throughout. Um, yeah, so I'm just looking at page 59. I just took one at random. Um, Gemini Factory, Returnee, Saltwater City, Not So Free, First Plague Ring, and Saltwater Flats. Where you're at is where you're at, and it goes on and on. And one of the, what am I thinking of? Yeah, one of the choruses or one of the lines that keeps getting repeated is the one that says, life after life, after life after. And I thought that's a beautiful passage because of how broad it can be interpreted, right? Or broadly it can be interpreted, I guess. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about why that would be something that's repeated throughout the text. What about life after life, after life after, and I'm writing it in the chat here, would be worthy of repetition? What does it tell us about the text, or its themes, or its purpose, perhaps? That's the last thing I want to talk about, and then transition to next week.
Actually, I think this is the meaning of life. Actually,
Okay.
we live cycles,
Yeah.
and then cycle after cycle, repeating after repeating, and we have there the word of recursion again. And it seems like there is no other way of living other than that. It seems like we are trapped in that way of living,
Yeah.
repeating, repeating, and it feels like if good things goes actually. Hello?
Um, Aya, do you mind just muting yourself for a sec?
Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I have no
No,
idea what time it
it's
is.
fine. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Marcio.
As I was saying, and this is a kind of a trap.
Mm,
I would say, if you will, right? We are in this trap there of repeating ourselves, and this is the rhythm of our lives. And basically, there is no coming out of that rhythm there, of that cycle, I guess. I might be getting crazy here or something, but this is what it feels like.
I like that. But no, I don't like that. But I like the idea, right, of the impression of cyclicality, right, and how to like
Yeah.
and wondering how to break out of it. which makes the last words, or one of the last words that Cora says, or the Cora tree says, all the more impactful, right? Never mind, says the patient Cora tree, I'll start again from the beginning, right? With an acknowledgement that there is not just a cyclical pattern, but a willingness to engage in that cyclicality, right? That can be very depressing, right? That, oh shit, we're repeating this again, right? Or we're doing this again over and over and we're not learning, right? But also of needing to repeat and cycle back and circle back, perhaps, right? As the cover indicates, right? In order to better understand, right, what we actually went through or what we lived through. So you're taking it in a more negative direction of like constant repetition, right? Almost like a hell, right? Of constantly reliving the same day over and over again. But I think again, one of the interesting things that I find about this book is that it can also be a source of renewal, right? Despite the repetitions, like you have a second shot at this, right? And what you do with that second shot is worth considering. Maybe again, that's me just being hopeful, but I like your interpretation as well. I genuinely do. Yeah. Um, yeah, or Alicia, anything you wanted to add about that?
Yeah, no, I think the way you said being on a loop, like a
Mm,
day you're living over and over again, I had that image too. It was like, yes, it does seem like hell at first because you're like, oh my God, I'm trapped in this, doing it
yeah,
over and over again. But the thing is, when you do it again and again, even if you don't notice it, you do change some things, change
yeah,
your behavior because you learn from what you've been doing and what has been happening. So in a way, it's a really good way of learning and just, growing up because you see it more than once, and that's the only way you learn something by, talking about something or living it more than once. You can't just base all of your knowledge on one thing that happened that one time. I feel like
yes.
you need to live it more times to really understand everything. So I
Good.
really like that option of just seeing it.
Okay. Good. Awesome. Um, all right. Thank you for all of your genuinely insightful comments onto the tiger flu. Right. I don't want to. I don't want to start necessarily a whole new topic with it, but I do. I do think this is one of those texts that you would benefit from rereading, as I've said many times before. So, one of the things that we've been alluding to passively, and that even Haraway talks about very briefly in her text, right, is the idea of posthumanism, okay? And what exactly that means. So she says, Haraway says in 101, 102 of the chapter I sent you. I am a compostist, not a posthumanist. We are all compost, not posthuman. Which is maybe like a weird thing to include in the middle of a chapter, right? A formally academic chapter. But she's pointing to something that people have been thinking about, I would say, since the 70s, probably, which is, again, where, at what point do we become more than human, right? So we've been addressing this a little bit in the tiger flu, but this is going to be an important question for next week's text, which I'm holding up right now in case you're not looking at the screen, of Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. I have a bit of a note on this that I'll make in a sec, but um, one of the things that's important to kind of think about is how a lot of people have been specifically mentioning and thinking through a difference of transhumanism versus posthumanism, right? Or where that line blurs or crosses over. Transhumanism being the idea of still seeing oneself as human, but being augmented perhaps by it. Right? I gave the example of a cyborg earlier. Right? I look perhaps like a cyborg to someone from the 70s, right? Because I'm almost constantly jacked into my headphones and I have like digital devices that are constantly attached to me and sending me all kinds of notifications and blah blah blah. But I would still consider myself a human. So that would be a transhumanist perspective on this. Right? Whereas a post-human perspective, like I said, would be something like completely beyond it, right? And this is one of the questions that I want you to consider for next week. Is the titular character of Swamp Thing, which you see on the cover here, transhuman or post-human? Okay. And I think there can be some good arguments to be made in one version or the other. Okay. But I'm curious where you kind of fall at the end of the day. Okay. Obviously, don't answer this now. If you haven't read it, you will have no idea what I'm talking about, right? But it is something that should be kept in the back of your mind, right? Yeah. Does that question make sense for everyone as a kind of guiding principle?
Yeah, no, I understand.
Okay, good. Um, quick note here. So first of all, if you have the physical copy that's at the library, at the librairie in Jambria, fantastic. You have the appropriate copy. I should mention, if you find a digital copy online through whatever sources you want, there are plenty. Just be sure you actually get volume one, right, of the Alan Moore saga, because or the Alan Moore written text, because Swamp Thing is a character that has stories that have been published for decades at this point. He's a character that's been around since the 1960s. So there are many writers that have been writing Swamp Thing stories. Okay. So I'm specifically going to be talking about the beginning of the Alan Moore stories on Swamp Thing. Okay. So whatever version you find, great. Just be sure that you have the appropriate one here. And brief note on the text. Because Alan Moore was taking over the Swamp Thing comic book from a different writer, right? So it was one writer who was writing it, and then Alan Moore took over as writer afterwards on a monthly basis. We'll talk about how comic books are published maybe a little bit next week. The first chapter is literally called Loose Ends, and it might seem a little bit jarring to read because Moore is basically finishing up the story that the previous writer had started, right? So he's just tying up literally those loose ends, and then he gets into his regular story, right? Which is the next chapters after. So if you find it a little bit confusing to start off, right, the comic book as it is on loose ends, don't worry, it will genuinely make sense in a way that Tiger Flu may or may not, right? So keep that in mind. Stick to it. It'll get better. And what else did I want to say? Yeah, the main story that I'm going to be touching upon for next week, obviously read as much of it as you want. The main story that I think is going to be important for us is, let's see, where is it? Oh, yeah. So there are multiple chapters in the text, right? Each are different issues and different, yeah, I guess different comic books, right? That all follow from one another. I'm mostly going to be focusing on chapters 2 to 6, right? So the chapter 2 is the anatomy lesson, and then it goes all the way to the end of chapter 6, which is called the sleep of reason. And that's one continuous story. And then chapter 7 and 8 segue out of this, right? But they're technically a different story. Read it if you want, but I think the more interesting part is like that chapter 2 to 6 part that is entirely self-contained and totally understandable as a story on its own. Um, okay. Does that track for everyone? Anyone have any questions about what we're doing next week or anything like that?
No.
Okay. Um, Out of curiosity, has anyone actually ever heard of the character of Swamp Thing?
First time ever.
Okay.
Yeah, me too.
Okay. Um, Marcio, I would have expected, because you mentioned Venom last week, I would have thought maybe you had heard of him.
No,
Because, yeah.
no. Actually, this is connected to Venom. Venom was inspired, or there is some kind of link?
Not formally, it's just I was wondering if you were someone who read a lot of comic books aside from Venom, that's all.
No, no. Actually, Venom is the only one
Oh,
I'm
okay.
actually.
Yeah. So if because people kind of aren't necessarily aware of this, Swamp Thing is a DC Comics character, so this whole story takes place in the same universe as like Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, all of these characters would be in the same world as Swamp Thing.
One
Uh,
question.
Yeah. Yes, Marcio.
You are much more like a Marvel fan or a DC fan?
The real questions. Yeah, this is where we get into the
mhm.
hot thing. My favorite superhero is Spider-Man. I really like him. Um, but if you actually looked around my apartment, I have more DC Comics publications around me purely out of coincidence. I genuinely like characters from both. I don't have a preference. Yeah.
Would you say Spider-Man is your favorite one because he is much more linked to reality because he has his own limitations and
Yeah.
not superpowers?
Yeah. 100%. And I
Okay.
don't. Well, there are some good Batman stories. On a fundamental level, I'm like, why do I care about this billionaire's problems?
Yeah.
That's
That's
right.
like a core problem that I have with the character.
That's a way of seeing it.
I do like Superman though, and that is completely opposite to Spider-Man, right? He's a god amongst men type of thing, but I do genuinely like Superman as well. I think when he's well written, there are some beautiful stories that can be done with that.
Mhm.
Yeah. Um, okay. Fantastic stuff. Um, I will I will leave you all with that, unless anyone has any other questions about my comic book preferences.
I had a question.
Yeah.
For the next week's reading, was there like a specific angle or certain parts that you wanted us to pay more attention to?
Okay. Yeah. I think you'd maybe left when I said that. Um, so there are 8 chapters in the collection. Yeah. Um, the chapters 2 to 6 are a self-contained story on their own, and but I still recommend reading chapter 1 just because it will give you some kind of context clues. But if you don't read chapter 7 or 8, it's not the end of the world. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
thank you.
It gives you. It may seem like a lot, right? 150 pages of comic book, but because it's a comic book, it goes by pretty fast. Yeah,
Yeah, I imagine so.
yeah. Um, and the text that I'm having you read next week, the theoretical text, is by Karen Barad. As usual, it'll kind of inspire the discussions, but it's fine if you decide to focus on Swamp Thing itself as a text. Barad is actually a physicist, right? So she has nothing to do with literary theory, but she was very influential as a physicist in how a lot of planetary thought developed. So when you saw in Haraway her use of the term intra-action, she gets that from Barad, right? Who we might unpack a little bit what that means. I don't know if we'll specifically in relation to Swamp Thing, but the idea is still from Barad. So she's very influential in the way that people have in the 21st century spoken about planetary thought, specifically from the perspective of how things that we don't consider as having consciousness, right? Trees, rivers, rocks, for example, can almost be considered as agents on their own because of the way that they are constructed and relate to other beings on a physics-based level, right? On an atomistic level. So that was very interesting for a lot of planetary thinkers, as you can imagine. So we might touch a little bit upon that next week as well. Okay, so I will leave you with that. And yeah, I'll keep the Zoom link active and let Leonie know that that we're going to keep going on Zoom until further notice. But yeah, thank you very much for this conversation. It was fun. And I know that it was a bit awkward perhaps at times for the Zoom format. I'm still getting my feet kind of used to it. But for next week, I would, as much as possible, like to see people's faces, just to favor conversation as much as possible. I know, Alicia, you were having like technical difficulties with that where that's concerned. But as a general rule, I think it will help with the way that the class is formatted.
I'll try to find a way to make it work.
As much as possible, of course.
Yeah.
All right. All
I
right.
can
So
definitely make it work. It was just I was unfortunately at work today.
okay.
I had a little schedule issue and I realized that I scheduled myself to work during
Again, I'm
class.
not saying it to like point specifically to you. I'm just saying it as a general rule that it's overall more appreciated, I think. All right. So see you all next week, and thank you again for your time.
See ya. Have a very good one.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Bye, thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye.
Bye.